Good morning, good afternoon, possibly good evening. Welcome to AWS Security Live. My name is Rob Hale. I work in AWS's security partner business and lead strategy across EMEA. But the highlight of my career is obviously being a Security Live host. We're a bi-weekly broadcast. We're out on Twitch, we're out on YouTube, and we pose the security questions that our customers want answering with an amazing group of guest speakers. And as ever, I'm joined by an amazing host, and this is the first time that we've hosted together. So big welcome, everybody, to Sarah.
Thank you so much, Rob. Yes, welcome everyone. Super excited to have you here. Would love for you to comment in where you're listening in from in the chat. I'm based in Nashville, Tennessee, and I'm in the AWS Security org. We help our customers make sure that we have the most secure experience on AWS. Super excited to host with Rob today, and also just being online. Normally, I'm in the in-person, and you might be able to see it, but I am repping my Security Live shirt here
Got the
today.
merch.
Exactly. You got to rep the gear, you know. And it looks like we have some
Awesome.
people from Seattle and Tampa. So
Yeah,
welcome everyone.
absolutely. And it's 8 o'clock in Pacific time. Don't know what that is in Eastern time. It's 4 o'clock in British summertime. 5 o'clock if you're one of our continental friends, and the middle of the night in Asia Pacific. So wherever you are, welcome. We've got a really great guest today as ever, actually. So we've got Sitaram Iyer from CyberArk. And Sitaram's the Director for Technical Product Engineering. We're going to be talking a lot around the importance of identity and permissions and all that great stuff. So would love to have Sitaram join us, and we can start the conversation. Hey Sitaram, how are you? Can you hear us?
Hello everyone, Sitaram Iyer. Thanks for having me, Sarah and Rob. Appreciate it.
Hello, welcome. Yes, and I know today, Sitaram, you want to talk about why short-term, short-lived credentials aren't enough. But before we dive into that, tell us a little bit about you, what you do at CyberArk, and I personally always love hearing a little bit about people's career history and how you got to where you are today.
Oh, excellent. Thank you. So I lead the machine and AI technical product engineering, as you alluded to, at CyberArk, obviously now Palo Alto Networks. So me and my team, we sit right between customers and R&D, and we spend a lot of time in the field solving real security problems, especially around machine and now very recently agent identity, and then bring those insights back to influence what gets built. We are technically the customer zero, as we are usually the first to break and definitely improve and all the things that reach all of our customers. So we see that first, play with it, break it, and make sure that it gets built in a way we want it to be built. So I spent a big part of my career directly working with developers and platform teams. That's where I started, obviously as a developer a long time ago, working across in the industry for, I think I've been around for 25 plus years now. So been here for a long time, but definitely working a lot with developers and platform teams. So I tend to think about security in terms of what actually works in real environments, not just what it looks like on paper, more practitioner. Spend a lot of time with building things. So it's been an interesting journey from where I started as a developer to now focused 100% on all things cybersecurity.
Awesome. Great to have you here.
Yeah, thank you.
So one of the things, you guys must see a lot of kind of challenges and questions and feature requests from customers. So could you give us some insight on the kind of things you're seeing in terms of what customers want to do and maybe what they're struggling with?
Yeah. So one of the common challenges that we see very often, and I have to sort of build a picture around how organizations operate. There's lots of technologies, as you know, within an organization. Some they're built over a period of the last 10, 15 years, some net new, lots of greenfield projects, lots of projects that have been ongoing. Nevertheless, large enterprises have a mix of technologies and environments that they operate at a big, massive scale. Some of them was built, like I said, a long time ago. Some could be 100% cloud, some could be 100% cloud native. The common challenge that we often see is the ability to sort of manage how different things talk to each other. I'm generally using the word things right now because I want to expand the thing to something else. But everything talks to each other, so which also means you need to figure out a way to ensure that they securely talk to each other. Most often, we always talk about, oh, I'm building a pipeline. That pipeline needs to talk and deploy to a service in AWS somewhere. Well, I don't know how to connect to AWS, but somebody gave me this credential. I'm going to stick it in here. It's going to sit there. Now my pipeline works. Except, a month later, that key expires or that secret goes away. That entire pipeline breaks. And this is one example. So now you can imagine there's databases that need passwords. There are API keys that are required for SaaS services. There's lots of different things that move across multiple different things. That is something that we have to use as a way to ensure these are all secured, and there is a standard around it, and there is a mechanism through which people can be assured that they have a way to access all of these services without having to worry about hard coding things, without having to worry about managing it separately, making it part of an application development lifecycle. That's the challenge that we are addressing, especially in the context of identity and ensuring each of these things, which I'm now going to call and refer to as workloads, have an identity.
Absolutely. And I see with identity being one of the most complex aspects of security, especially as you mentioned, Sitaram, around all the different resources or things. I know you're going to dive into it more, that we see here. And something that we see, around developers, and I know you were saying that you've worked with developers a lot. When do you feel like it's that moment that they realize that IAM roles might not be enough in their cloud workloads as they're building out their architecture?
So IAM roles, generally, obviously, if you've lived in the world of AWS, everybody knows IAM roles very well. They've used it because without which you couldn't have done a lot of things that you do in AWS.
Yeah.
If you sort of, this goes back to the comment I made earlier about diverse environments, multiple different workloads across multiple different things. And IAM roles for service accounts, IAM roles anywhere, any flavor of that, depending on what you use, works really great, as long as you're in the AWS boundary. And as soon as you leave it, it starts to, you start to think about, how you actually have to manage it, how you actually have to figure out, what applies here. And I think typically when developers are building and deploying applications, perhaps that runs on a virtual machine or a physical server that requires access to AWS, and that's when you start to see challenges around, how do I leverage the same set of policies without me baking in some credential in my virtual machine that will eventually use the IAM role, but I need to get to it. And how do I get to that IAM role? And how do I sort of, help federate into that IAM role and identity and use the services that I want? I think that's where you have to start thinking about, what's beyond IAM role and how I can actually help it.
Yeah, that's one of the key things. There's also a flip side to that in terms of developers, and you mentioned it. Baked in credentials, and that's a real risk. But it's something that gets the job done, right? So when you're developing and you just want to make something work, let's just put in some credentials there. It's fixed. You're not thinking about that because you just want to get the application working, and it gets lost. It gets forgotten about. Probably goes into a repository somewhere, and then hopefully your security folks, maybe AWS, will pick up on those credentials, and you'll be able to resolve that. But that's a real security kind of challenge in terms of how do we make sure that best practice is in there with roles that don't have permanent permissions, that aren't static. By the way, if you're listening to us wherever you are in the world and you have a question about identity, maybe you're a developer, you want to know what the best practice is. Maybe actually you're a security practitioner and you're trying to implement best practice, or you have a question or a challenge, then do please send us a comment, ask us a question, and we'll do our best to answer it.
Yeah, and one other thing, some of you might have noticed the acronym alert pop up on the screen. So when we do our in-person Security Live, we have an acronym swear jar where we have to put coins in. And so if you see that come up, we know that not everyone watching knows what all of these different acronyms mean. So Jess, who's our amazing producers behind the scene, loves to do this. So I think she called out that we had SaaS, so software as a service, and IAM, which is identity access management. So we'll make sure to call those out as we go more. But it's
And
hard
hold
because
us
you
through
guys know
down.
we're
Yeah.
just so used to it. They are just so ingrained in our minds.
That's the challenge, right? So, you guys call us out as well. If you hear an acronym, put it in the chat, call us out. We have fun with it. Our production team will shout at us and say, "Hey, it's an acronym," but it's great fun and good practice. So yeah, hold us to account. So
Yeah.
Yeah, and we are going to throw in a very big acronym very soon. So
I'm waiting for that acronym. We'll get the we'll lead up to that a little bit. So you mentioned earlier around things, and that's a really important thing from if I can say that from an identity perspective, in that identities don't have to be human. And they don't have to be physical devices. They can be non-human identities, or there's lots of different terminology that goes around things like service accounts. And now we have obviously agents as well that are acting on behalf of humans and non-humans as well. So talk to us a little bit about how you see strategies for kind of managing that level of access, and what challenges that might pose.
Absolutely. I think let's do it with an example. I think that could help map all the things that you talked about, because you talked about several things, on behalf of the agents and, machines accessing something else, workloads accessing something else, humans accessing something else. In a typical organization, many a times when they are building something, they're building with a purpose of delivering something for their customers, because that's the end goal. We're all writing code, we are all deploying something because we are serving something, our end customers. If you sort of imagine for a second that we've got a virtual machine or a physical machine, doesn't matter, and we have a large bunch of code that's running, and that code at some point needs to access something from an S3 bucket. Simple example, right? So, which also goes back to saying somebody from that machine or something from that machine needs to have access to an S3. So now I said somebody and something. The somebody obviously refers to the human. The something refers to that machine or a workload. The IAM policy, obviously, on the AWS side is designed to help facilitate who or what can access what resources that it is providing for. So I'm just sort of building the blocks here, different personas. Cloud architect may have done all the S3 stuff, defined the IAM policies. Now I have a developer that is sitting here. Rob, just as you said, the developer has options. Well, let's take in the access key secret and then put it as an environment variable. My machine is good. It can always access S3 using those credentials. Well, if it rotates, then we have a challenge. So now, if you sort of imagine for a second that this is a machine that needs access to AWS resources, what if we had a standard way of ensuring that we can attest or figure out the characteristics of this machine and generate a unique identity that is specific to that workload, specific to that machine, specific to that process, depending on the granularity that you choose, and then help figure out how we can generate a new identity for that specific workload and use that as a basis to access that S3 that I was talking about. One, eliminates the whole access key and credentials that sits there. Two, ensures that you have a standards-based mechanism through which you can actually generate the identity based on the runtime characteristics, not necessarily you saying, I want to call this machine A, or I want to call this Ubuntu B, or something like that. It's not that. It's the metadata that defines what the characteristics of that identity structure looks like. And three, ensures that this is issued just when it's needed, for what it is required to do, and when it is required to do. All of those characteristics that are built in. And the industry is obviously has sort of converged into saying that if we were to do all of those things, one, we need to have the ability to generate and manage a unique identity, which is universal in nature. And two, it's more important to be cryptographically verifiable because these have to be cryptographic identities. So what I'm referring to is a standard that we've all sort of, at least learning, seeing, probably heard about, you're probably playing with it, you're probably using it already, is this industry standard that's sort of, converging across multiple different vendors, partners, developers, teams, which is called SPIFFE. And I said I'm going to throw in a big acronym.
It's the mother of all acronyms, right?
Yes. And I think there is an acronym to an acronym there. So like SPIFFE stands for like Secure Production Identity Framework for Everyone. So it's a long,
nailed it.
it's a long acronym, but what does it really mean? And I think it's more than that. And I'm pretty certain you will never hear somebody expand on that acronym because it's going to take 30 seconds just to expand on that acronym. So you'll probably hear SPIFFE. SPIFFE is this standard that basically establishes how an identity should look like, what the I'm going to introduce another acronym, SPIFFE, and then there's something called an S-word. I'll expand on that, hold on to that for a second. And then basically ensures that, the identity is, like I said, universal, can be exchanged with any identity provider to get native tokens. In the example that we talked about, where we had a virtual machine that needs to access an S3, in this case, a SPIFFE ID would look something like SPIFFE:// whatever the boundary I want to trust, and then I would probably have another part which says workloads or machines, and then I would say Ubuntu A or my IP address of that machine or process B or my Python code. I mean, as you can imagine, the options are there are lots of options, but establishes something that you can use as a way to identify a workload. But that's not where it stops. Just an ID is just a string, nothing more. So you need to sign it. And when you sign it, you get something called an S-word. It's a verifiable identity document with the S being SPIFFE. So if you ever say SPIFFE S-word, you first expand SPIFFE, and then you expand the S in the SPIFFE, and then you do the verifiable identity document, and we'll be spending the next 15 minutes just expanding on the acronym. So SPIFFE S-words essentially are that signed documents that you would use for establishing the identity and trust. And most importantly, in this case, once an ID is generated, a SPIFFE S-word is generated, again, there are multiple options. You could say my application support JSON web token based S-words instead of saying JOT. I just did the expansion, or an X59 based S-word. So it could be a certificate based S-word or a JOT token. But you essentially present it to AWS, and AWS says, "Yeah, I understand this. I'm going to give you something back that I understand very well, that I can use as a way to access my S3 bucket and S3 services that you can use on that machine to read, write, whatever is allowed for you to do." So now what really happened was no credentials there, no baked-in credentials. You have something that's running on that machine that has the ability to generate the S-words, exchange that S-word for a native AWS token, and use the native AWS token to access the AWS services. Pretty standard. I could replace AWS with something else. It could be a physical machine somewhere. It could be some other service, whatever that might be. Anything that has a standard way of operationalizing your workload to access the services, SPIFFE supports that.
Yeah. That's a really good. Thank you for that. That's a really good explanation. And you mentioned in there as well the importance of having almost a single pane of glass across all of your environments as well, because whether you're digital native on AWS or whether you have an on-prem environment as well, or you have SaaS, so software as a service, you need to monitor and manage those identities across all of the different platforms, because that's your real realm as a security practitioner. We've got quite a few questions actually, so I'm going to spin this around a little bit. So we've got two questions. I'm gonna ask Jim's question first because it leads on directly from what you were saying, and then the infamous Joe G has another question which is far deeper. So Jim's question is, how do you differentiate AI identities and governance over their access?
Yeah. So I think there was a reason why I started off by introducing these things as things, because that way I could fit the thing into anything. And in this case,
Forward thinking.
in this case, and that's where we're leading. I mean, obviously, in all the conversations that are happening, So, like, what does it mean when I am running AI agents? Or in the case of Agentic AI, I have my own agents that are being deployed and developed. And what does it mean? Again, I'll take an example and I'll address the governance piece, which is very critical. But when you operationalize all of these things, and I like to take another example. So let's imagine, again, as practitioners of AWS, you've used a lot of different services. Now you stumbled upon AWS Agent Core and said, great place, and I want to start developing some AI agents, and then I'm going to have them do some of the tasks that I've been doing repeatedly, and then tie in some inference model around it so I can talk to it in natural language and all of those things. Obviously, Agent Core says, how do you want to manage identity? So, like, where does it come from? Because for every agent that is deployed in an Agent Core, we want to be able to ensure that it has a unique identity associated with it that can be mapped back to the characteristics of that agent, as long as that agent is running, working, operationalized. Again, AWS has taken the approach of saying, let's do SPIFFE-based identity. Even the SPIFFE JWT capability to exchange a JOT token is natively built into the Agent Core's deployment. So you see where this is going. So, like, if you want to be able to exchange a token and operationalize Agent Core, I can do it right here. You don't need to go and create an identity provider, which we typically do for other services, and then create a trust relationship, do all those things. For agents, it's right there in the things. So what I'm trying to say is AI agent identity is also critical to the aspect of, how agents themselves are attributed for their actions, what they do. The identity drives that, so that, when you start to govern, audit, log, create those receipts for all of the actions that are being performed by these agents, the governance model essentially is all around what can an agent do, that what can be tied back to the identity of that agent to say, these are the identities that are allowed to do X or Y. And when they do it, the audit and the compliance and the logs and everything maps back to that governance model that you built in.
Yeah, and I think
for those wondering, sorry, I was going to say, for those wondering what JWT is, so JSON Web Token. So it's an open standard that means that you're able to securely transmit information between JSON objects. So good thing to kind of put in there. Sarah, there's a question in the comments in there you wanted to read out.
Yeah. Well, and before we do that, Jim had one follow-up question, Sitaram, for you, is what should he be doing right now when it comes to identities and governance? So if you have one pro tip, I know that's maybe a broad question, but what would you suggest Jim does?
Yeah, so one of the things that we talk about is, when you have any workload, and I'm talking generally in the context of machines, agents, all of those things, because for a large part, when we think about humans, it generally solved problems. When somebody is doing, if I or you are accessing some services, we've already authenticated, we've gone through the workflows and all of those things. Machines don't go through those workflows very often, because you bake in some sort of a service account or some API key or something there. One conversation that we always have, and I've had this multiple times with different customers, is when you think secure by design, one of the first steps in your workload is to design how will I see this workload from outside? If I were to look at a list of things that I'm running, in this case, the workloads, agents, how can I identify them? And that's where it comes in. How do I give it an identity? That identity, when it is given through a standard like SPIFFE, helps you establish multiple different characteristics. One, all of the trust boundaries that you define. It could be dev, it could be prod, where they are running, what business application they are serving, even more runtime characteristics around associated with it. And the second part is, you don't have to worry about how they will access other things once you have an identity, because the runtime attestation mechanisms kick in as soon as you deploy that workload. And then you can use that identity and the signed part of it, which is the S way to perform and access other services. And in almost all cases, when we talk about this may find like a old story when I say we need to eliminate secret zero. We are eliminating secrets. There is no secret here. It's runtime workloads, just-in-time identity that is issued, access established, and then you connect to the services that you need to connect. What I really want people to do is, when they're writing code, think about it in a simple way. How do I see it from outside? Can I identify it? Which means I need to think about identity from day one.
Awesome. No, that totally makes sense. And one last question. I know we have about 5 minutes left, and we want to get to our call to action too. But the infamous Joji, amazing user handle, by the way, really like that, asked a question. So I'll try to explain the acronyms as we go. But Amazon Elastic Kubernetes Service, EKS pod identity, and IAM roles for service accounts, and Spire on EKS, aka SPIFFE runtime environment. We love all the acronyms here, fun to explain. So AWS is clearly investing in pod identity. Where does SPIFFE-based identity fit into pod identity world, especially for workloads that authenticate to anything beyond AWS?
Yeah. So a short answer to this is everything that is listed here is specific to EKS. So as you can imagine, my answer is going to be static in a broader world of everything that's there. Obviously, IRSA, IAM roles for service accounts. I'm trying to expand the acronym as well now that we have established that we should do that.
Now that we've said it, you can use all the acronyms you want.
So IRSA is extremely useful, especially when you're deploying workloads in Kubernetes, and helps you map a service account that owns the workload to some AWS service that you want to use, so that you don't have to bake in credentials. One way to solve a problem. Pod identities essentially establish, how you associate something that can tie back to another role, or something that can be used within the workload itself. So there are several mechanisms. What SPIFFE is essentially trying to bring in is a standard around it that can be used across multiple different environments and in a universal way. A specific example could be that the same application that's deployed in EKS could also be deployed in ECS, could also be deployed in a non-containerized world, just as a way of ensuring that you have a highly scalable option of providing these services in different ways. You can't use pod identity in something else. You can't use IRSA in ECS, but you can certainly use a standard that works across all of these things. And that's really where SPIFFE-based identities shine. But there is one important aspect. SPIFFE is a specification. Somebody needs to implement it. And I think where I'm trying to get to it is, there are open source projects that actually implement the SPIFFE specification, but there is also somebody like us who implement the SPIFFE specification, because, one thing is to adhere to the standards that are defined by the SPIFFE, which says, hey, you need an identity, you need to implement a workload API, you need to have trust domains, you need to have all of these various different things that you have to follow the specification, but something has to implement it. And I think that's where you have the ability to go and understand what we do at CyberArk. The whole idea around, what does it mean to help manage those issue identities, manage the identity lifecycle, manage the governance around that, all using SPIFFE with the implementation that we have. So we call it secure workload access, just generally as a way to say that your workload could be anything, could be running anywhere, could be deployed anywhere, could be in any environment, and could be doing machine to machine, human to machine, whatever that might be. There's lots of combinations of things around it.
Awesome. So what we're hearing is, use a platform, use an identity platform that works across all your environments, that's going to give you just-in-time access with limited credential life, that you can manage and track with really, really finite rules. So you can make sure that you can access the right areas, but not over provide and not give too much access. If you want to find out more, by the way, about workload identity, and actually there's a workload identity 101 webinar replay that covers SPIFFE and how to solve secrets and sprawl across cloud and other environments, then click this link. Hopefully it's in this corner still, but grab the QR code and you can have a look at CyberArk's webinar. It's been awesome to have you. Thank you very much to come
Thank
on
you so
board and talk to
much.
us about identity. And we'll see you all again very soon.
Thank you so much, Sarah and Rob. It was great being here. Appreciate it. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, good morning, possibly good evening. Welcome back to AWS Security Live. My name's Rob Hale. I lead AWS's security partner business in EMEA, so I help to act as the glue that brings together our amazing partner community with AWS native services to solve for customer security challenges. So my greatest achievement is to be a host on Security Live. But I'm not alone, so I also have, along with you guys, an amazing audience, a great co-presenter. So Sarah, introduce yourself, please.
Thank you so much, Rob. It is great accomplishment to be a Security Live host. So you're crushing it. I love it. My name's Sarah Curry. I am with AWS Security in the Office of the CISO. And we work with all different types of customers to make sure that AWS is the most secure cloud provider to build on. And so we're super excited to be here today. Some of you might have been with us for the CyberArk segment right before this. We're super excited now to transition to Palo Alto Networks, where we have Sahil Mehta, who's our product manager for Prisma Airs. So, Sahil, super excited for you to join us today.
Hey,
Hi.
welcome, Sahil.
Super happy to be here.
Awesome. And
Cool.
for those of you that are watching live, please feel free to add comments in. If you were watching the last segment, you can see Rob and I try and pull all the questions we have so that we can answer them in real time. So please feel free to comment in and let us know where you're calling in from. I saw we had someone from Italy for the last one. So
Yeah.
buongiorno, or whatever time it is there. I don't know. I'm in Nashville, so it's
They're
morning.
1 hour ahead, so of us anyway. So it's coming up to 5:30. So yeah, they're probably enjoying an espresso, sitting in the sun. Maybe they're still probably at work. But welcome to all of our friends and guests across the world. And we are live, by the way. We have been asked before, are you really live? Pop a comment in the comment section. We are absolutely here. We're not AI bots, we promise. And we will answer questions, hopefully, on the subject. So, Sahil, what are we here to talk about today? What do you guys do at within Palo Alto, and tell us about yourself and how you came into this role.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a product manager at Palo Alto Networks. I work on AI security, specifically Prisma Airs, which is Palo Alto Networks' platform for securing any and all risks that AI applications and agents have. I'm excited to talk about some of the challenges that we're seeing organizations face as far as they're adopting agents of any kind, what security and safety risks that they have to deal with.
Awesome. Yeah, and obviously things are moving so fast with the speed of agents and everything going on. So what I've seen in the industry, and Sahil would love to see if this is what you're
Yeah.
seeing too, we see a lot of customers who are building prototypes, but then getting it from prototype to production becomes somewhat of an issue because maybe they don't have the right guardrails in place. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're seeing and how maybe some pro tips for helping people get their agentic workloads into production?
Yeah. And I think a good place to start is getting as clear and deep of an understanding as possible of what exactly the risks are, what are the most real ones, what are the ones that are maybe more future focused. And I think a good philosophy to start with that is first aligning on a definition of, say, what is an AI app and what is an AI agent. So, for example, an AI agent, just to speak very broadly, at least how I and many folks in Palo Alto Networks would define it, is an entity that uses AI to make decisions and execute on those decisions. And now, obviously, that can take a variety of forms, but a few of the common forms that can take are applications that any developer or any organization would build that can perform these kinds of agentic tasks. But it goes well beyond that. It can also be entities like that exist on an endpoint. A classic example being on many of our laptops, I'm sure we have one of the various types of coding agents, whether it's Cursor, Cloud Code, or whatever your preferred coding agent is, installed on your laptop endpoint device. Now, that's also an AI that can make decisions and execute on them. And if we use that as an example, I think it can give a hint as to where a lot of these risks are, because that kind of coding agent has not just the ability to generate code and talk to an LLM. It can access my file system. It can read and write stuff. But more than that, really, it can do destructive tasks like delete a bunch of stuff on my laptop, or it can access the internet. And that's where we see a lot of the risk occurring, is once you give an agent the ability to do perhaps even more things than I can do, that's where it has a lot more security risk. The way you address that then is by first getting complete visibility into, as an organization, what are all the agents that are being adopted across my endpoint, across what I'm building, and then putting in the right security controls accordingly.
Yes, that's really good advice. And that's something that when I talk to customers, one of the first questions, particularly from a security leadership perspective, is how do I get visibility of my organization's use of AI? What models are they using? What applications are they connected to? Agents is a thing that we've seen. Customers have a huge increase in interest in launching, and a lot of pressure actually from the business to productionize those. So what are some kind of tips that you have for actually for getting visibility, and what are some of the kind of, I guess, approaches that customers are taking to the whole world of how do I enable agentic AI or maybe even AI applications?
It's a great question. In that's probably, to your point, the first challenge that organizations would face is first understanding what is happening where. And I think to answer that question, it's first helpful to build I'll call it taxonomy of the universe of kinds of agents. And for example, a helpful taxonomy that we found is putting them in, very broadly speaking, 3 categories. There's agents that are on endpoint devices, agents that folks are building and hosting, ultimately as, say, application workloads that are on AWS, calling AWS models, etc., and agents that are being run on third-party SaaS platforms. Now, once you have that taxonomy, in order to build that visibility, ultimately you need sensors in place in each of these components. It's not going to be one single silver bullet discovery solution. For example, you'll need some kind of sensor that can be deployed on endpoint laptop devices to then discover all of the usage of the Cloud Codes and Cursors of the world. You'll need some kind of sensor that can tap into cloud environments like AWS to see, here's all the workloads in AWS that are then calling AI models and calling tools and MCP servers, for example. And you'll need sensors that can hook into third-party SaaS platforms to understand what kinds of agents are being built there. So the short answer is getting a picture of what are all the possible agents that could be built, and then deploying sensors accordingly. And then the exact sensor can then be vary depending on what kind of implementation you prefer. For example, Palo Alto Networks has sensors to help with discovering stuff on the endpoint with our XDR and more recently COI. And it's just one example of the kind of sensor you can use to discover agents on the endpoint device.
I think that's super important, especially, as we see this sprawl. And while it's a great problem to have that everyone's building agents, they're moving faster, being able to have that visibility. And like you said, Palo, having that monitoring on the endpoint. We do have a question that came in from Erie_edits. They said, subjective, I know, but what do you suggest as a balance between agent access versus security? So the age-old, security question: how do you balance moving fast with the business while keeping everyone secure?
Yeah, and I think the optimistic take that I have, and I think many folks that I've worked with have, is that ideally it's as less of a trade-off as possible. I think in Palo Alto Networks, we always like to say that you can deploy and do whatever you want to as long as you do so safely. And how that actually manifests then is, like, let's say you're building an agent and you want it to give all of the tools that it necessarily needs. Now, any tool that it needs to perform that its functionality, it should have access to, as long as it can scope permission so it doesn't go beyond that. And how that it can actually manifest is, for example, you can have governance and whatever interception policies in place to say, okay, given the 10 agents that I've built and the 100 tools that it's calling, here's the access policies on which tools they can access and which ones they don't. And scope it in a way, just sort of classic security least privilege, that I'm not hampering any of an agent's capabilities, but I'm not giving capabilities beyond what's necessary. And then on top of that, conducting not just access governance, but runtime security inspection. Ultimately, if you're able to say, I'm regulating access for an agent only to the tools that it has access to, and for the tools that it does have access to, I am inspecting all tool input and output, I'm inspecting all LLM input and output. That's what allows you to adopt all of these capabilities, but do so safely, because everything is still going through some kind of guardrail to enable all of the actions that are executed to be done safely.
It's really good insights, and it actually mirrors with when I talk to customers. And I was talking to one of our customers, Chief Information Security or CISO officers. This was a large insurance company, CISO, but really working on a lot of agents and large language models, so generative AI. But one of the things they were talking about was treating agents like digital toddlers, and to kind of expand that a little bit. So, and this is not my idea. This is an awesome idea from a customer. But they're saying, look, you're giving this agent, tools to do things because you want it to help. You want to be productive. So you give it a set of crayons, but you put it in a white room with no controls, no guardrails, and no one monitoring it. So best not to do that, because if you don't have those guardrails, you don't have those carefully scoped permissions, for example, then it's going to start doing stuff that maybe you hadn't intended it to do. And some of this is trial and error, right? So you need to know what the agent's going to do. So I think the upside to this was be careful about what access you give it, but also monitor what they're doing as well. And that's the runtime element, because agents can go and do a lot of things, as we know, but the challenge is, how do you scope it correctly and make sure it's productive without proposing more risk in the organization?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think another way to think about it as well is, as long as you can track what are all of the entities that this agent could interact with, and that comes down to having that visibility and then governing the tools they can access to, that's where you can build a clear picture of ultimately what do I have to inspect. So for example, that means in the supply chain, you do need to get visibility into, for example, all of the quote unquote skills that the agent can access. This new concept of skills that many of you have likely heard about now, where any developer can publish an open source, pretty much markdown file with scripts associated with it that provide instructions on what an agent can do. And it helps a lot with conducting many specialized tasks. But as a result, there's many cases of skills having poisoned instructions, skills that, if hooked into an agent, can manipulate it to exfiltrate data, for example. Now, the way that you prevent that kind of risk isn't simply saying, I got to lock down and prevent usage of skills, because they're an extremely useful asset. And anyone who's been doing coding agent development, for example, has likely used them before. Instead, what you do is say, why don't I first track down and continuously monitor what are all the skills that are actually being adopted, and then verify which ones are safe and which ones are not safe. And the ones that are not safe, I find a way to scrub from my environment. That can then enable you to adopt a technology like skills, but do so safely. And then it applies in runtime as well. Once you have an agent that is making runtime tool calls to local and remote MCP servers, for example, you have to let the agent do that, just because of how fundamental that functionality is. But what you can do is implement some form of runtime security or runtime guardrail to say, if there's certain kinds of malicious commands or credentials going in my input to MCP servers, that I should lock that down and prevent it. So it goes down to the point of enabling all of these capabilities to be integrated, but monitoring and everything that's happening and enforcing when something malicious is clear.
Absolutely. And you talked a little bit about endpoints and the security risk as a whole for looking at the life cycle of agents. So when it comes to talking to different customers that you're speaking with, they might be looking at training their own models, model validation, model inference, and the endpoint. Do you see any part of that phase where customers maybe need to focus more on adding guardrails?
That's a good question because the simple answer is each phase needs some sort of
Yeah.
security, but I think maybe the most useful answer to it is which areas are perhaps less or more focused on than others.
Yeah.
I would say that there are the two main categories of areas that at least I found have among the largest open space of attack vectors are supply chain configuration and
Mhm.
runtime security. So I think oftentimes what's easy to miss is just the vast supply chain that feeds into an AI agent, because that includes the model, not just model training data, but model artifact files. So, for example, if you're pulling a model from Hugging Face, it's fundamentally a bunch of, for example, .safe tensor files, .pickle files, whatever form of model that you're using. And there's various examples of how that can have malicious code or other kinds of malicious exploits inside of it. So you would need to monitor, for example, all of the model artifact files in your supply chain. That also goes to monitoring all the skills you're using in your supply chain. Or if you're configuring an agent on a third-party SaaS platform, that has that has a bunch of settings on what permissions it has and what it can and can't do. So you need to monitor what configurations you're giving that agent and lock down anything that might be overly permissive. That's one giant area that, in many ways, is a can of worms to unpack. But once you do unpack it, you become a lot more secure. Second half of it is what's actually happening in runtime, unpacking runtime security for LLMs, which includes the ability to prevent your classic jailbreak attacks, prevent model resource overconsumption, sensitive data leakage, excuse me, and then also applying that to tools, preventing a usage of tools in a way that can cause malicious code execution, preventing leakage of credentials to tools. So to answer your question, I think the two broad categories of things I would focus on if I had to just pick two are locking down everything that's going on in the supply chain and ensuring that nothing malicious is going into it, and then implementing runtime security inspection across all of my LLM traffic, all of my tool traffic, to ensure that everything that my agent has to adopt is doing so safely.
That was a great answer. I love that. And I know for those of you who are visual learners, I think, Sahil, you had maybe an architecture diagram that kind of ran through the different security risks that you can look at from build to runtime and kind of help inform different security measures that you might need.
Yeah, can you see the screen?
I can.
Great. So a lot of tiny text here. I won't go through all of it, but I think it helps build a bit of a deeper picture on the universe of categories of kinds of risks and the universe of agents. So for example, if we focus on this on the left hand side of the slide, this enterprise agents box, and then we can see how this maps to the categories of agents that we talked about a few minutes ago. We have enterprise agents, which are agents that any organization or developer might build and host in-house, fundamentally as some application workload. You have third-party SaaS agents, and you have, for example, endpoint agents like Cursor, Cloud Code, Cloud Desktop, etc. And each of these types of agents will have supply chain risks like agent code being vulnerable to attack, or malicious skills or other kinds of malicious local tools. You have runtime risks, like LLMs themselves are vulnerable to prompt injection and jailbreak attacks, content safety risks, leakage of sensitive data. And you have runtime risks below that that are very specific to agentic systems, like hijacking an agent to do something it shouldn't, or leakage of credentials to external tools, or execution of malicious commands by those tools. And in the middle, you have this array of governance and identity risks, a lot of which were just touched on by Sitaram earlier in the session, but includes things like usage of tools that are unsanctioned, or usage of agents that don't necessarily need to be done in the environment. So this helps build a framework of the universe of threats to track and how that fits into what's in the supply chain versus what's in runtime. And Frameworks like the OWASP Top 10 for LLM and OWASP Top 10 for agentic applications, for example, are also very useful to help build a picture of how I, as an organization, evaluate how safe I am.
That's awesome. I think a lot of that is based on things like OWASP Top 10. So OWASP is the open. I'm going to get this right now because I haven't actually done the acronym for a long time. So Open Worldwide Application Security Project. Is that right, Sarah?
Crushed it. Yes.
Hey,
Killed it.
I haven't said that acronym for a long time, but there's OWASP. They're a great bunch of guys. They're an open source organization. They crowdsource information and they produce guides. OWASP Top 10, for example, for LLMs, so large language model security, and also for agentic security as well. And a lot of these elements that Sahil is talking about are documented in there as things to kind of look at. So I think it's great to use that kind of framework within the explanation.
Yeah. And I think one way that this can feel a bit real, just to give one example of it, is we go back to that example of an endpoint coding agent. Let's say I'm developing an app and I'm using Cursor to do so. Cursor being one of the various kinds of agentic systems you can use for code generation. Now, we've seen cases where that kind of coding agent has access to not just read my file system, but perform fairly significant actions on it. And for example, everyone who's played around with Cursor have seen that you can automatically delete files. Now, whether by a mistake made by the AI or whether by instructions injected by an attacker, such as through a malicious skill, there's not that many steps required to get someone to delete my entire file system or to find environment files that have credentials and send them to some external server. All that really requires is finding a way to manipulate the AI model's context window to insert new instructions, classic prompt injections, to, for example, manipulate it to read my .env file and then send credentials to some third-party IP address. It comes to the point where some kinds of attacks that previously may have required some kind of advanced persistent entity to perform now can simply be done by just hosting a malicious skill on Cloud Hub or take your favorite open source tool and just allowing developers to download it and manipulate their own AI accordingly.
Yeah, I think it's really important because you've got developers who want to use tools that make their life easier and faster, and then you've got there's different kind of tools that you can use. Some have guardrails in, some don't at all, and that's one of the things that customers talk about. AWS Kiro is that you've got a service that's an agentic IDE. So you can develop your code in there, but you've also got guardrails in there. So however you engineer that, whichever services you use, you need to have those guardrails in there, so your security and your privacy infrastructure is and policies are in place, and you can kind of let the developers use the right tools, but make sure those controls are in place. I was talking to another customer, and they were commenting that look, the innovation around agents isn't going to come from IT. The innovation for agents is going to come from application owners, from users, etc. And so, one of the most important things that we can do as a security team is how do we enable our employees and our companies and organizations to innovate, but innovate with those guardrails and security so they can move faster but stay secure. I thought it was a really, really important area.
Yeah, and on that point, like if you, for example, are someone in IT or in some security team, I think a good framework to think about it is ultimately you have to be ahead of your own developers to the extent possible. And that includes, for example, looking at what new protocols are out there, what new tools developers might have access to that even they haven't fully adopted yet. Yeah. So one example is Skills and MCP. MCP came out around December of 2024. Skills came out, I believe, late last year. And what that means is keep on the lookout for, okay, what's the latest thing that someone can plug into their agent, like MCP servers, and assessing, of course, is this going to be well adopted or not? But assuming that it is, what are the security risks that it has? So, for example, as a security vendor, Palo Alto Networks, that's something that is quite critical for us to effectively serve our customers, is understanding, okay, what is the next big thing that even developers of agents may not fully have adopted yet, and then extracting from that what are the real security risks that it has. That allows you to at least prepare as much as possible. For example, let's say tomorrow some new kind of supply chain asset comes about, like such as today it was skills, maybe tomorrow it's something else. Now, recognizing that should then feed into your discovery strategy. For example, you have a sensor on the endpoint, as we talked about. That sensor maybe today can recognize skills. Tomorrow it should recognize whatever that new asset is. And that should feed into your runtime inspection strategy. However, that asset manifests into actual runtime tool calling and LLM invocations, your runtime security inspection should factor that in. So that's just an example of, I think, the kind of framework that might be most helpful for someone in IT and in security that might need to stay as ahead of as possible of the developers they're trying to secure.
Yeah, and I think that's where security has the most value. I talk a lot with customers around, how do I make sure that we are relevant to the business and we're relevant to somebody on board, for example, for stakeholder support and for financing. And one of the key things is you've got to make sure that security is business relevant and you're enabling the business to serve customers better or to innovate. And you're not going to do that, frankly, if you're behind the curve, you say. And developers, these guys, and we've got loads of developers as in our audience who tune in regularly, and they want to use the best tools, they want to use the latest tools, and it helps them be more efficient, move faster, write better code. So we have a tenet within Amazon and some of our most productive customers as well, which is, make security the easy button or frictionless security. So, if you've got two options, one is super secure, but it's a nightmare to do anything. You've got another which is less secure, but it's really, really easy. Then users are always going to gravitate to the easy option. So make security the easy option is a topic that comes out with a lot of our advanced customers.
Yeah,
I love
and
that.
I think.
Sorry, go ahead, Sahil.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think to that point, to make it as easy as possible, that's where having as few enforcement points as possible is important. So for example, rather than having 10 or 20 different kinds of tools you're using for security, ideally having, for example, one entry and exit point that all of your LM invocations and tool calls go through. That's where this concept of a gateway came about, where it's to say, let all of my runtime traffic for agents, for LLMs, for tools go through one control plane. And I can do whatever security inspections, whatever governance I want to have on top of it. And to your point, that helps facilitate that kind of easy button, because then you're giving developers a standard practice. They don't have to ask questions or think through necessarily the security themselves. They can simply be given, here's the guide to follow, integrate with this standard practice that our organization has, this standard control plane. And that then enables the adoption to be a lot swifter by giving a clear and standard process.
Yeah, and that helps you to kind of battle the shadow IT or shadow AI kind of drive that's there within all organizations, because people want to be productive and you want to use the cool tools that make their lives easier. So you've got to be, if you're in security, your job is to essentially keep the company safe, but also enable the company or the organization to be successful in a secure way. So I love that approach.
Yeah, and I'd add on top of that too, and Sahil, it sounds like you're doing this, but always learning, because we say in AWS Security, taste the soup, that as chefs are making their food, they're tasting it as they go, and we don't want to be the security people that say, no, you can't use that tool, but we've never touched it ourselves. Until it sounds like you're doing that with keeping up with all the different trends and being a thought leader in this space. So I think that's a really important part. One last call to action, speaking of always learning, Palo Alto, if you go to the QR code in the corner there, yes, I love it. There's an immersion day on May 12th for Cloud Next Gen Firewall. So, Sil, I don't know if you have anything to say about this, but for those of you watching, please sign up so that you can learn more about what Palo Alto has to offer with integrating with AWS.
Awesome. So if you want to join the session, then QR code's there. Sahil, it's been amazing having you on board. Thank you so much for the conversation and the knowledge as well. Really useful for me, and I hope it was for our audience as well. Join us in a couple of weeks for the next episode of Security Live. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Hill.